Hello everyone, and welcome to the very final section of our 5-day bootcamp. Congratulations on making it all the way to the end, and all we'll do here is do a quick project summary covering what we did at each step along the way and how we did it, and then I have a few slides prepared for us that will just summarize the full 5 days. So this is kind of where we began in main activity, talked a little bit about what we would do to start off with, then we built up our two main pages. These were activity_main and activity add item. Once those two main screens were built, we connected all of the elements that we needed to main activity and also to our add item activity. So these were basically the variables that represented those UI elements, as well as some of the functions that we need, for example, our nav to add item, action, and then the necessary functions in add item activity. After that, we moved on to implementing some of the actual navigation itself. So this was basically just creating these intents and starting activities, and then worked on building up our recycler view. So this took us a few sections. A recycler view is a fairly complex UI element, so we had to build our custom adapter. This was our to-do items adapter, and then the custom layout that goes along with it. This was our to-do item layout. Once we had that built, we learned how to attach on-click listeners to elements such as text views that don't naturally have an on-click, and then how to interact with the rest of the application. Next, after that basic list functionality was done, we moved on to planning out our database. This was done in database info, where we basically provided the schema for our database. This kind of explained how the database would be laid out and how it would be used. We also created our custom to-do item object, and then after that started implementing our database functions in database operations. So these were divided into our four main add, fetch, modify or update, and delete functions. And again, these are all using Android's SQLite database, which is an on-device database, which is great because that means we don't even have to have internet access. After we implemented those functions, we implemented within the rest of the app where we want those functions to be called. For example, our fetch is called in main activity using the cursor. Add item activity is obviously used to add or save or update items. And then we're deleting items in our to-do items adapter on the long click listener. And the final day, which was today, was just kind of going over some improvements that could be made to the app. In our case, this involved just separating out the tasks that we have planned for today versus in the previous days, and then just displaying those different lists of values. Okay, so that's a quick summary of our project as a whole. Again, we will be including the source code. We'll be providing it to you guys, so if you missed something along the way, then don't even worry about it. You can either go back and watch that section, or you can just read up on the source code here. So now let's turn to the slides I had planned. This was basically our intro to Kotlin bootcamp. We built a practical Kotlin app, in our case a to-do list, from scratch in just a couple of hours. So the main topics that were covered were basically how to build user interfaces using Android's interface builder and through the XML code itself. We used a combination focusing mostly on XML. We also learned how to interact with interface elements through the use of variables and listeners. So this was attaching stuff like the recycler views, text views, stuff like this to variables, and also adding those on-click functions. In our case, some of them were on-click listeners that we attached to a particular variable. In some other cases, we actually just specified the on-click in our XML files, and then just implemented some kind of a function in the corresponding activity. We learned also how to create and use custom classes and objects. In our case, we had a couple of them. This is not even including the database classes, but we had a custom to-do item object that we used frequently. And we also had that adapter that we had to create from scratch. That was a subclass of a recycler view adapter. Next up, we learned how to plan, build, and use the Android SQLite database, a very powerful and easy to use tool. And again, we learned how to set it up, how to actually call upon those functions and execute them. And this is really great for storing data, which you'll end up doing in a lot of different applications. And finally, in general, we just learned how to implement the backend functionality and add new features to an already existing app. We saw that this can actually take quite a bit of work if the features are more complex and involve several different parts of the app. So, our 5 sections, so all of those tasks were divided into these 5 main sections, and these were basically corresponding with each day. Our first day, we started by building the main layout pages and adding listener functions and variables. Again, connecting basically those layout files to our activity files. The next day, we focused on building the recycler view adapter and our custom to-do object. Now again, that recycler view adapter is necessary to bind data from our to-do object to certain views that can then be inserted in our recycler view, which acts kind of like a list. And building adapters is a pretty key skill to have because there are lots of different UI elements that require special adapters. Okay. After this, we learned how to attach on-click listeners to stuff like text views, and we also planned out our database. So this was basically building up the database schema. Next up was implementing the actual database functionality, so building the functions to perform those actions in our database operations class, as well as actually writing in the code where we want to execute the functions and exactly how. So in the fetch case, we had to write our cursor functionality to basically loop through and get all the information from the appropriate columns, whereas functions like delete, add, and update didn't really require too much work. That was basically just calling the function and passing the parameters. And our final day was just adding some extra features to the app, improving the overall smoothness, how everything worked, how it all looked, and again, just generally improving everything about the app. So by the end of this, you should be able to perform these basic tasks. You can now build interactive and responsive layouts and interfaces using XML and Android's Interface Builder. Very important skill to have. It's important to not only be able to build up the back end, but also the front end. I would say almost the front end is more important if you're trying to make that $1 million app, because no one's going to want to use it if it doesn't look or function very well. After this, you can also implement custom adapters with listener functions. Like I said, this is a very important skill to have, as lots of different UI elements do need these customized adapters. Okay, this allows you to be more interesting with the way you build your app, as well as just add that extra level of customization that your customers will really appreciate. You can also implement and interact with custom on-device databases. In our case, again, we use the Android SQLite database, and focused on 4 main subsets of functionality: a basic add function, basic get, update, and delete functions as well. And saw that once we know how to do it once, it's actually pretty easy to customize. It's just getting started. You might not necessarily know exactly what methods or variables to pass in or to call, and so on and so forth. But now you can do that. Again, you'll be using, if not this database, an online database in most of your applications, as at some point you will need to store and persist data. And you can also now just build fully functioning and practical Android apps using Kotlin from start to finish. If you want to use Java instead, the process is pretty much the same. It's just slightly different syntax. I find Java just a tiny bit more difficult to use, but that being said, I still enjoy coding in Java just fine. It's just Kotlin. It seems to be Android's newer language. A lot of apps are starting to be built in Kotlin. It's just a little more user-friendly and a little easier to use. And the fact that you now know how to do every part of this app development process is massive. There are not that many app developers out there who can completely build these apps from start to finish. Lots of people specialize in only one area, so having this wide subset of skills is very important.